My institute is in charge of monitoring the lake, and we are the organizations that provides advises the Israeli Water Authority on how to manage Lake Kinneret or Sea of Galilee. And as the role of director, I interact with them nearly on a daily basis, providing them with advice and answering questions. The Israeli Water Authority about a couple of years ago, for several reasons not irrelevant to this discussion, decided that they want to construct a system that will allow them to move water, desalinate water from the coast of Israel to Lake Kinneret, which is a reverse of the national water carrier, which in the past carried water from the lake to the central part of Israel and southern Israel. And in deciding to do so, it was a big change in the way they saw Lake Kinneret, and they decided that they need to use the lake as a strategic reservoir on the one hand, but also to use it to connect regions in Israel that are currently unconnected to the national water grid. And so they're constructing this system, and but there was a debate, or there still is an ongoing debate, and that's putting it very mildly, about how to do it. And there are two options on the table. One is to move all the water to the lake and then to pump water from the lake to the various regions that need to be connected to the water system. The other option is to pump part of the water to the lake and part directly to some of those regions. And there's several reasons why the two different options are on the table. But after they conduct their analysis of two options, the Israeli Water Authority decided that one of the options would be better, and that's the option they want to go with. However, there are several organizations, and mainly the main Israeli water company decided, or don't like that idea. They prefer the second option. And I think the main reason is because it means that they'll be losing out on about $300 million project. However, this has evolved into quite a hot, warm, or heated debate. But the Israeli Water Authority are the ones that make the recommendation to the Water Council. And several months ago, the Water Council had a meeting on this topic, and the head of the Israeli Water Authority asked me to give a presentation with my opinion on which option would be better. So we had this meeting. I got up and gave this presentation, saying why I thought one option was better than the other. However, there's a lot of uncertainty in both options, in both solutions, and also in what the future entails. And I kind of tried to explain the various uncertainties associated with both options, and why under different conditions one option would be better than the other. However, I end up with my recommendation for one of the options, given all these uncertainties, and ended. The meeting went on and ended, and several hours later, the head of the Israeli Water Authority gave me a call and said, "Thank you for your presentation. However, with what you said today, I can't go to the bank with that. I needed a very clear recommendation of why one option is better than the other option. With what you said today, you didn't provide us a clear yes or no answer to our question." So we had this debate of why I can't say yes or no, or one option is definitely better than the other. But it was obvious that this policymaker, or this decision maker, was looking for a clear, definite answer, and he didn't want that murky gray area of uncertainty in the decision-making process. And so one of the outcomes of that debate with him, or that discussion with him, was that a couple months ago I gave a seminar to several of the scientists at the Israeli Water Authority, talking about uncertainty in ecological systems, in aquatic ecological systems, and trying to explain why questions aren't black and white, why there's no yes/no answer, but there's so much uncertainty in the way the system operates, in how this future may fall out, and how the system may react to that future. And so rather than trying to deal with assumptions, let's try and deal with solutions. So for a group of engineers, it's hard to see that, it's hard to understand that, because when you're planning pipes and things like that, things are a lot more clear and less uncertainty. So yeah, so this is a very big issue when I deal with policymakers, and they're very happy, you know, when we're having a general meeting and that debating or considering issues, you know, looking to the future. They're very happy to hear my opinion about uncertainty and things like that. But when it comes to making decisions, they want a definite answer: yes or no, option A, option B, no in between, no gray areas. That can't help us. Thank you. And so it is definitely an issue that I deal with, and you know, and so how do you deal with that? You know, on one hand, you know, I want to provide my advice and my knowledge and our experience and our expert opinions, without risking giving them an answer that is not entirely correct. So I'll stop there at this stage.
That's very interesting, Gidon, because this really sort of brings us to one of the two main thrusts that led to the founding of the DMDU Society itself, one being to be an organization of service to its membership, but the other to kind of reach out and address the policy process itself. I mean, what I interpret you saying or translating it into these terms is that the way the policy process itself is constructed and what the expectations are of the people who are involved in the policy process, whether in the planning phase, the decision phase, or the implementation phase, that in itself is sort of problematic for bringing in, you know, exactly the sort of expertise that you and your colleagues possess, without the possessing the ability to say absolutely authoritatively, we've run these experiments and this is what you ought to do. Let me now turn to Arthur Peterson and ask for his views. I would once again invite people who are attendees to place in the chat questions that they would like to address either to individual members of the panel or to the panel as a whole. And when we go through this first round of short remarks, we'll then open it up to a wider conversation. Arthur, the floor is yours. The virtual.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Stephen. So what I would like to do is discuss one example that I'm framing as an example of DMDU, and that's the example of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I will explain how this was really relevant as a kind of laboratory for the types of discussions that we're interested in here and what I have witnessed there over the past 30 years. But first, an observation on science. So making more explicit in the way Stephen started, that scientific work involves tacit knowledge, expert judgments. Of course, nothing new for those who study, let's say, philosophy of science, do science studies. Science is not about just let's say, giving a fully certain picture of what's really in the world out there. I don't need to tell anyone on this call that science is not about that. It's about working under uncertainty, building your models and theories, and you make reference to what's happening in the real world. It's and you actually try to provide useful information in the end about what's happening in the real world. But there's nothing new to scientists in terms of how important, let's say, tacit knowledge, expert judgment is. Now, in the example I would like to discuss here of having, and I'm framing now the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as a tool of DMDU in its entirety in terms of how the process is structured, how it's organized. I've been studying it since the early 90s. First, from an outside perspective, as a critical philosopher, not believing that you can have, say, consensus about uncertain things, that it can be just politics. And then I started to actually really study, and I came to different conclusions that you can definitely reach a sensible, a member of the UCL delegation to the IPCC. And what you see in that body about expert judgment is that the authors, lead authors, they have been asked to write those chapters, not only for the fact that they have a lot of publications in the area, of course, yes, but it's really because their judgment, their tacit knowledge is needed in order to assess what has been published over the previous few years. And that's a crucial element here in the whole mechanism. That's again obvious to those involved, but it's downplayed in a sense by kind of making this a mechanism, giving an image of the mechanism that it is an algorithm that just goes through all the publications and then automatically we know what we have learned in the past few years about climate change. That's not what it is. Now there are two elements here I want to stress. One is these authors are typically asked, and from DMDU we may be critical of that, to give their likelihood, their assessment, their probability of their main conclusions, whether they're true or not. So there's a long history. I sat at the table in Shanghai in 2001, and for the first time, a probabilistic assessment was given to the world that it is likely that humans have been causing most of the warming. It was a major step, right? Expert judgment has played a large role in that. Just a small example of that, the models would say it's more than 90% certain or 95, but they went down to 66 because they didn't trust their models. They couldn't explain that in the report. I had to write a whole doctoral dissertation, go in the emails between authors, interview people and reconstruct, right, what went in there. And I'm not criticizing it for it happening that way, but it's just flagging how difficult authors find it in the IPCC and more in general, how scientists, how difficult they find it to reflect on the role of their kind of expert judgments, their tested knowledge. I studied also the errors in the IPCC report. I was asked by the Dutch government to lead the investigation into the errors in the IPCC report. I did it in 2010. And what we typically found there, that most of the main conclusions in the IPCC report, that was working group 2, on the impacts of climate change, they were not traceable to the underlying report. So again, there's a big flag that there's all this expert judgment going in and you end up with robust conclusions, I would say. But there's no way it's traceable to the report. And we recognized you cannot make it fully traceable, but you have to do some additional steps in order for people to find out, okay, this was a group of lead authors that came to a particular judgment, and can we understand where that came from? Final example, sea level rise. This is one of those questions where you don't want to start with what the models can do and can say, and then give that information to the policymakers. Now, the policymakers, especially the Dutch, they want to know what is a plausible upper limit of sea level rise, for instance, in 2100. And I've been actually a hitman for the Dutch government within the IPCC to force the authors to give a number, and they have not given it in 2007. They were not willing to give it in 2013. They were not willing to give it while the publications were there. They could have done it on the basis of the expert judgment, but they didn't dare to. Only now, in the last IPCC report that came out in August, for the first time ever, they dared to say, this is our expert judgment of the upper limit of sea level rise in 2100, which is 2 meters. It took a very long time to get to that point. So this is just demonstrating how difficult it is and how important the topic is that we're discussing. This was just one example. I think we can go on for hours on this one, but that's what I wanted to contribute, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arthur. So what do you think is the potential for a, sort of a reframing of professional conduct might be based upon, I don't know, there's in economics, we speak of, supply push and demand pull. Is it going to be, scientists seeking to place more of their knowledge at the providing more of their knowledge to policy and this deliberation processes? Or is it going to be, as in the example of the Dutch, wanting to get some expert judgment on sea level rise? Is it going to be the policy community reaching out and trying to enable and franchise this sort of expert judgment in a way that's going to be, comfortable for scientists? Do you have a sense on what that balance might be between supply push and
very
demand?
quickly on this one, I would think a 50-50 balance. So there needs to be a demand, but there must also be a supply, and it means in the training of ourselves as experts. So you get trained as a scientist, but to get trained to be an expert, playing a larger role in society, it requires a particular type of self-image and self-confidence and humility in order to engage. So and it depends then on the political system, right? It may be easier to kind of be humble in the Dutch system compared to in the American system. So if you have a consensual-based politics system, it's easier, I would say, for us experts to be vulnerable in that process. In an adversarial system, you may need to design other ways that people are comfortable with telling that they make their judgment on the basis of everything they've learned, but they cannot really fully trace it to particular publications.
So there's almost a sociology surrounding this. Just as a parenthesis, I had occasion at one point and for a project to look at decision making about old age pensions. What in the United States we call Social Security, and comparing the policy practice in the Netherlands versus that in the United States. And in the Netherlands, what you would see is that there would be some sort of legislative action, and then 2 or 3 years later, another legislative action based upon the experience of the prior action, and so on and so forth, on a fairly continuous basis. Whereas in the United States, the tendency in this field and in many fields, whether it's taxation policy or whatever, to come out with a policy, assume that is the end of the story, and not do anything for 30 years until it becomes clear to everybody that there's something wrong. So the nature of the policy environment itself is certainly different, even among Western democracies. So let me now turn to our third panelist, Chris Hill. Chris, do you want to take the floor?
But let me start by picking up a word that Stephen used in his introduction, the word dispositive, and the notion that scientific fact or scientific knowledge or scientific advice might be dispositive in policy debates. And my first observation would be based on my own experience working with the Congress and not directly, but indirectly with a number of executive branch agencies, that it is rare that settled scientific knowledge is dispositive in policy debates. I once had an opportunity to testify before Senator Al Gore on the subject of the relationship of science to public policy making, and I said that science rarely offers answers, and that at the Congressional Research Service, where I was then employed as a scientific expert, if you like, I said we almost never got questions in the science branch that could be answered by appeal to scientific fact. Someone did ask once, one member of Congress, for the melting point of bismuth. And we were able to answer that question. But otherwise, the important policy issues involving science invariably could not be answered by going to the literature or going to the telephone, or in those days we weren't doing email yet very much, and asking distinguished scientists for the answer. And if you could find a scientist who would give you an answer, you probably best not trust him or her, because inevitably those scientists were reflecting their own biases, prejudices, preferences, and institutional connections and conflicts, explicit or implicit, as they might have been. So that the general notion that became very popular here in the States during the early COVID fights was, and I call it fight, not the debate, was that you should follow the science. But in fact, that's not very helpful advice because it's rare that the science is actually taking you someplace that you can be sure about, especially if it's emerging science. Having said that, I also think we have to ask, what are the alternatives to having this rather awkward, ill-posed, incomplete, tacit array of scientific expertise opining on public issues in order to try to get somewhere close to an objective understanding of circumstance and outcome. And remember that one of the ways to do this is to take a scientist and put him on a stick and hold him over an open fire until he screams and tells you the truth and then let him down. Or alternatively, you could dunk him in a water tank, or you could draw him and quarter him. I mean, these are some of the methods that have been used in the past. So we've made some advances over what we might do. We could take a handful of stones in a basket, throw them on the ground, and see what sort of traces they made in the dust, and infer from that how things were going to work out. Or we could roll some dice, or we could ask a witch or whatever. So we're not so bad off with the science advisory apparatus we have as compared with what we might have. At the same time, scientific understanding is almost in areas of interest, of significance to policy. Scientific understanding is contested. The notion that scientific communities consist of a number of well-intentioned, honest, thoughtful, transparent individuals publishing their very best results and having it out in a public arena is simply not what goes on. People hide things, people bias things, people give you half the story, as was pointed out in the opening remarks. People's own understanding is limited. I mean, scientists, by and large, are a stupid lot, except on what they know. And then they can be brilliant, but otherwise their understanding is limited. And of course, it's contingent. What they knew last week is not what they know this week. So the great Anthony Fauci, probably the most famous scientist in America right now, has been pilloried for changing his mind on whether wearing a mask is a good idea. And he did change his mind, and he had good and sufficient reason for doing so. So his knowledge was not absolute. It was contingent, contextual, and time dependent. It was dynamic and probably also biased. Tony Fauci has a bias. He would like to see Americans live. I'm not sure that bias is shared by all the people who take him on. Scientific observation about public issues is inevitably strewn with paradigmatic assumptions. Physicists tell you one thing, chemists another, biologists another, an ecologist another, a limnologist another, and so on. And that reflects the tacit understanding they have of the way the world works and how that is played out in their disciplines. One of the phrases I find particularly useful in thinking about contributions of scientific expertise in policymaking is to argue that scientists as individuals have interests. Interest in the sense that a political scientist would understand an interest. They have preferences and things they value. And at the same time, interests have scientists. That is to say, the oil interest, the environmental interest, the interest of the people of the country of Poland, the interest of the tribes in the Amazon, they all have scientists who are in touch with and in tune with their interest and reflect those interests in the policy debates that matter. And so we can't really count on science and scientists to be sources of purely objective information. Now, what do we do about this? I think that the key to resolving some of the problem of dealing with uncertainty is to embed the expertise in institutional frameworks and not individual frameworks. That it's the collective wisdom of a group of scientists of various backgrounds and stripes combined with that of other kinds of expertise, whether it be sociological, legal, political, economic, artistic, historical, philosophical. It's the combination and integration of knowledge, in which in certain cases, scientific knowledge might be privileged as above other, that enables us to make some progress in helping policymakers figure out what the likely outcomes of their actions will be. And scientists almost never know the answer to that question and almost never know the answer in an unbiased fashion, except in either trivial cases like what is the melting point of bismuth, or in edge cases. An edge case might be something like asking a scientist what would happen to humanity if the sun blew up. I don't think there'd be much debate about that, though that would be the end of humanity. That's an easy one. In between, there are a lot of questions that are more challenging. Almost 50 years ago, I taught a course in technology assessment, 1972. And one of the books we used in that course was Charles Lindblom's book on the politics of muddling through. And I was very pleased to see that book cited in one of the papers that appears on the association's website. The notion of, as someone said earlier, about the Dutch, as Arthur said, about the Dutch mode of decision making, making a decision, coming back in 3 years, seeing where you are and doing it again. That seems to me still to be an extremely important way of dealing with uncertainty. You use the world of reality as your model, rather than a model that you build on a computer or someplace. I think we could just say, looking at the practice of technology assessment as it was done in the United States, not necessarily as it's being done today, nor as it was done in Europe or in Japan. And you would see many of the same issues being grappled with: sensitivity to context, to institutions, to governance, to the diversity of preferences, struggling with the scope of concern. After all, if you ask the question, if we take a policy step, what will happen? It's not a single thing that will happen. Many things will happen, most of which we can't figure out in advance and come back to be the key things that we should have worked about but didn't know enough to do so. And struggling with how to frame the scientific expertise question and how to present the results, something that the late OTA spent a lot of time thinking about for many years after I was there. And I think it might offer some very useful insights to take a hard look at that literature, and particularly that part of the literature which was self-reflective. So with that, I made a bunch of notes on the COVID case, which might be fun to talk about, the COVID vaccine case, but we'll save that maybe for dialogue.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all of the panelists. There's a question in the chat that was posed by Alejandra Lopez on how do you define an expert, which I think is a tip of the iceberg of a larger question, which is, if you have somebody who writes a paper that is highly cited in a positive sort of way, that connotes a certain expertise. If you don't have that, if you have more informal bodies of knowledge or more informal discourse, you know, who then is the expert? And I would maintain that this really brings us to the kind of the central focus of this panel, which is that my feeling is that nobody is an expert on things that have not happened yet. We draw upon people who have expertise in things that have happened, or that they have observed and have explanations, but we tend to invest those people with an authority that perhaps they don't really possess, or are willing to obtain for themselves an authority that they really do not possess. One of my problems with Delphi methods, as they're usually applied, is that you are bringing together, you know, experts on something that has not happened yet. We have behavioral psychological research on how experts will overvalue their expertise and the knowledge that they possess. So what you will get is a very comforting, you know, reification of conventional wisdom, as opposed to what you really want, which is to understand, I think, about how many different reasonable guesses there are about the future. Which brings me back to, you know, DMDU techniques, where you are very often at a stage where, if you have an expert panel, you are trying to understand what are the boundaries of the plausible. You know, how widely should you search for, you know, alternative cases, alternative scenarios, alternative futures? And that kind of brings me to a question for you, Chris, that is, and I may not have done justice to Alejandra's question, and would certainly invite other members of the panel to weigh in, but just following up on your talk, Chris. So again, I am a proponent of a particular way of addressing complex policy problems in complex policy spaces. And I view its principal value is that it reduces the need for expertise, for authoritative expertise, and instead draws upon a wider experiential base. But as has already come up in this conversation, there's a whole sociological aspect to this. You know, one way of encapsulating what you said, Chris, is that scientists are people, with all of the pluses and the minuses that go along with that. So let me ask you, and this is really kind of a question to the whole panel, are scientists, and of course that's a very wide group, we're speaking in generalities, which already is problematic, but are scientists eager for a different avenue, a different means, a different rhetorical approach to policy and policy makers? There is a lot of discomfort on the part of scientists when policymakers reach out for precisely the reasons that you said. You know, they're interested in, and Gidon said this, they're interested in yes and no answers to questions for which the answer either yes or no would be wrong or inaccurate. So would they just as soon be left alone, or is there, you know, kind of a willing partner on the other end of the transaction to seek new, as I say, a new rhetoric, new avenues, new conduits for the intersection between policy and science?
Would you like me to take that on?
Yeah.
Brief.
And I would invite the others to also join in if they they wish to speak.
One point I would make is that there is a kind of tacit knowledge associated with being an expert, a useful expert in the policy process. There are ways to behave and ways to present oneself and ways to frame answers and ways to frame formal submissions to councils or committees or members of Congress and so on that can make a person a very valuable and useful expert. But many folks who would like to be thought of as expert turn out not to be very useful precisely because they don't appreciate some of the things that Stephen had said and that I commented on regarding the limitations of their own expertise in the policy process. So I had a lot of opportunity to observe this when I was serving the Congress in two different ways over an 8-year period. Regarding bringing experts to bear on important policy questions. And there were plenty of experts who were more than willing and anxious to talk, but you dare not put them in front of a congressional committee or take them into a private meeting with a member of Congress or staff, because what they were really wanting to do was plead for their profession and for the absolute importance of understanding material science if you're going to make aerospace policy. And they couldn't get out of that box. On the other hand, there are a relatively small number of people in the United States who are, and this sort of begs your question, Stephen, are recognized as good scientists. They've made lots of contributions, they have leadership positions, or they have been recognized through prizes and awards and stature measures of all kinds, who are very good at opining on a whole array of things that come before policymakers. And they tend to get, over time, anointed as reliable, thoughtful people that you should call on over and over again. And if you have a hearing and you bring them in, they're going to make it interesting. They're going to say something useful. They're going to say something maybe provocative. And part of our job as staff people to the US Congress was to know who some of those people were, to observe them, to look at their writings, to talk to them, and to understand that if we called, they would come, which is another, I mean, that's a very desirable quality in a scientist as an expert. If you call, they will come.
Thank you, Chris. There's another question, but before turning to the question, let me turn to the other members of the panel. Gidon, Arthur. Arthur, I see that you have your hands up. See if either of you want to weigh in on the discussion at this point.
Yeah, so let me also address this question on what is then a good expert, right? So there's a question on, basic question on what does expertise consist of, but I had a nice exercise that I did 18 years ago together with Marjolein van Asselt in the Netherlands, and we were asked to compile some recommendations on well, how you should frame expertise on uncertain risk issues, and we produced what we called a crib sheet for policymakers. What are the questions, or for staffers, right? So thinking about what Chris is saying, what are the questions, kind of screening questions you can ask potentially useful experts in terms of finding out for these deep uncertain issues whether they are really the type of experts that you want. So we had 5 questions. One was really asking them straight on, what is your experience in dealing with uncertainty, right? And let them talk about the main uncertainties from the perspective of the decision that needs to be taken, or that's the policy area that's under the discussion. But also asking them the question, if you yourself as a citizen look at this, are you concerned about the risk that we are discussing in this area, which then makes it explicit in a sense that it's not it's a human with interests also outside of the purely scientific realm, but they bring then all their let's say expert judgment to bear on whether they are afraid of something. And it's just one of those very interesting emotional tricks in a sense to get at it. I'm not saying that makes them authoritative, but these are some of the screening questions, whether you can check whether they are sensitive to engaging in the types of processes we're talking about.
Thank you. Gidon?
Yeah. So these questions are really interesting issue. And first of all, as was mentioned here, there there are cultural differences between countries and the way processes are run and the impact of the way we do things. But I think that there are several processes acting here at the same time, sometimes in contrast to each other. So decision makers are looking for clear answers to questions on the one hand. On the other hand, the reports such as Arthur mentioned, the IPCC reports, in which they give some sort of estimates of the likelihood of something to occur, not an actual number. That type of report, high profile reports such as those, I think push decision makers in the right direction in terms of they realize that there's not always a yes/no answer, and there's not always a clear answer or a number. You can't always put a number to the question they provide. So that's I think those type of high profile reports are very advantageous to this process. On the other hand, I think scientists are weary or concerned because if they go in a question about what's going to happen if, and they come back and say, well, I need some money, I need 2-3 years of research, give me the money, I'll come back and give you an answer, and then they come back and they don't have a definite answer, the next time they won't get money for their research. And so there's this play of what you think should the answer, the correct answer is. On the other hand, do I take this risk of not getting funding next time? And so so there's this culture and there's this process of which we need to educate both the decision makers and also the scientists about providing the best possible information, even though it's not a yes/no or an exact number that the policymakers are looking for. And I think the more we see these type of high-profile reports coming out saying that there's likelihood of something happening, but not definite, I think we'll move more and more towards that objective of being able to come up to policymakers and giving them, an answer attached with a great deal of uncertainty in that answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Of course, that raises another problem, which is that people really don't understand probability and what it means, and B, policymakers hate probability and statistics because they know they're being fooled somehow, that the wool is being pulled over their eyes. They're not entirely sure why, but at any rate, yet another aspect to consider when we come to this sort of discourse. Let me say that I, as a courtesy to our panelists, as well as to those who are joining us from inconvenient time zones, we'll run this panel for no more than 90 minutes. So we're within the last half hour now. I would invite you to either put a question into chat or raise your hand. Warren, Chris gave us an opening to talk about COVID-19. I sense he has more to say about it. You have a question. Do you want to raise your question, Warren?
I'm very concerned about what's happening in the United States in terms of truth versus fiction, if you will. And one example is, and this goes to what Chris said, Fauci says he wants to see people live. That's what I want to do. That's what I would hope most people want. But the anti-vaxxers, what do they want? And as a scientist, what can we say to them and to say to the policymakers who are also anti-vax? I mean, the governor of Florida, for example. How do you deal with anti-science.
Can I rephrase that slightly?
Go ahead.
Or let me try something on, Warren, and you tell me if this is in the spirit of your question, which is that it's one of the things that I've been thinking about. Where do issues of trust enter in? You know, let us say the business as usual approach to bringing science into policy discourses, whereas, you know, when I first started looking at this sort of thing 30 years ago, this was, you know, science was an area in which, you know, one of the rare areas in which there was not politics in the United States. Now there is, and there is what you cite as an example is an instance of, I would say, unsuccessful engagement between the science and the policy, or at least portions of the public. So now we're talking about another conduit, you know, sort of in a policy discourse that is in line with the concepts, practice, and methods of decision-making under deep uncertainty. Is that an opportunity, you know, to contribute to the what-if type inquiries through DMDU analysis that would reduce or enhance the perceived trustworthiness of their input? In other words, what if it was not a situation of, as Chris has pointed out, I mean, part of the problem is that this is emerging science. What we thought we knew about COVID, you know, in February and March of 2020, when we were, you know, scrubbing down all of the vegetables and the packages of breakfast cereal that we brought home with great trepidation from the market, you know, our mail that we let sit for 24 hours before opening it, compared to what we knew in, say, June of 2020, compared to what we knew in December of 2020. I mean, the need to make explicit statements in a rapidly changing or very uncertain environment probably worked to degrade the trustworthiness of the science. If there was another avenue to introduce that scientific knowledge, would that either enhance or further degrade that trustworthiness? That's a little more general question than you asked, Warren, but I think it's a little more in the spirit of that.
It gets to the heart of what decision-making under deep uncertainty is all about. It's what do you do when you can't do predictions, you can't do probabilities. And what our book, everybody should get our book, basically says is come up with some policy, but monitor and be adaptive. And that's what the message should be from DMDU.
Right. Arthur?
Yeah, of course, no full answer to this one, but I just wanted to flag, I was happy to escape my country, which just entered a partial lockdown, and visiting the US now for 2 weeks. And one of the things that struck me in the T in Cambridge, Boston, is to have this huge sign in it which says it is natural to question the effectiveness of vaccines. And then they have a link to a website of the local kind of health authorities of Massachusetts. But it's just as one of the things we need to think about is this whole idea of what Warren is referring to as well, is there is a permanent inquiry. I mean, this is very much in line with one of my favorite philosophical streams, American philosophical pragmatism. We are always experimenting, and we're always in an inquiry together. What are ways, this open question, deep cultural question, what are ways that people kind of don't think of scientists having all the answers, but trusting them for doing the best that they can in highlighting what they know and what they don't know, and being a partner in that discussion. So rephrasing the same question, I just wanted to kind of give that anecdote of something that struck me, as I think, but this is Massachusetts. It's not representative of the whole United States of America, but there's a nice way to communicate that we really don't know a lot of things.
And be adaptive. I think the key word that we should somehow give out is you don't have to stick to one thing. You can be adaptive when things change or you're not exactly right.
So we are constantly questioning, we're constantly learning, we're constantly adapting, except that you can't say that. You can't say that in American politics. You know, we elected you, do something. And at least, you know, the questions that we ask of scientists also, you know, seem to try and pin them down. Chris, I don't know, you're the one who brought up COVID-19. I don't know if you want to interject some thoughts.
Well, first, let me say I have great respect for the plan, do, check, which is the way the Japanese talk in English about proceeding incrementally and trying something, seeing what happens, and then go back, take a fresh look, and try to modify what you're doing. So, unfortunately, perhaps in the COVID case, we were doing plan, do, check every week, as we learned and tried, and for us to understand how to cope with the uncertainty that was inherent in the enterprise all the way through, Stephen, if you laid it out, we cannot have that conversation without bringing in the fact that from the very beginning, there were extremely strong interests, political interests, in changing the narrative and ignoring whatever the scientists had to say, public health experts and so on being included, for political reasons. So we had a kind of hyperactive intervention that was, what was its intent? Its intent was political, its consequence was murderous. And it's that sense in which I would contrast Anthony Fauci's very deeply held commitment to life, which we probably all share, with other folks whose commitment to preserving human life takes second place to some other objectives they have. And that's pretty tough stuff. That's pretty tough stuff to try to deal with using some kind of an analytic method. I don't know that there's if there's an analytic method and someone's sitting here in the audience with it, let me suggest you make it known, because you will become an extremely powerful person.
One of the concepts that I think apply to most of the methods that come under the rubric of decision-making under deep uncertainty, and as Warren alluded to, where there are half a dozen methods that are discussed in the handbook that was sponsored by the Society and is available from Springer Press for free download. And one of the tenets is that, you know, in a sufficiently complex or uncertain space, you are going to confuse yourself by beginning at the beginning. And what you need to do is to begin at the end and talk about, you know, what is it that you are trying to achieve? And very often there is no bottom line. That is to say, you have a number of competing interests that are, you know, to one degree or another antithetical to each other. You want both a growing economy and environmental sustainability. And to make those as explicit as the various assumptions regarding either the parametric uncertainty or even the fundamental structural uncertainty about how causality works. And that this is a way of somewhat subversively exposing some of the hidden agendas. Of course, you need to have people who are willing to play that game. But there are some of us who have had experience of conducting analyses which then lead to the enhancement of the authoritative expertise that different stakeholders can bring to the question. You know, you had this analysis done, the RAND Corporation or Deltares or the Technical University of Delft came up to with these conclusions. How can you explain now this diversion in policy from this wide encompassing examination of policy that was conducted by these people? But you know, that's me as a booster. That's me as an advocate speaking. Alejandra, you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question or pursue your original question, which I subverted for my own nefarious purposes?
Maybe a little bit of both. I kind of wanted to talk about what Warren said when he said, what do anti-vaxxers want? And I've been thinking about that question too, right? So because it's like, what is the point? And I think a lot of what science tends to like kind of present itself as, it's very, it feels sometimes like it doesn't account for lived experiences, right? So, you know, somebody's telling you something, but you're living a completely different reality. So I guess I think that's kind of like what anti-vaxxers, their perspective is, that they aren't seen or heard. And I wanted to ask all of you, how much do you take into account, or how much should you take into account lived experiences, right? I'm a mathematician by training, and it's mathematically, it's very hard to do that, but also scientific, like how do you push that, right? Or in your respective fields.
I have thoughts on those lines, but let me first ask Chris or Gideon or Arthur if they want to reply. So,
the short,
yeah,
oh, sorry,
go ahead,
yeah,
Arthur.
just really briefly. So I had to kind of task at one point to investigate whether in the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, in our integrated assessment models, why couldn't we in the mathematics include also, let's say, international relations, human behavior of all sorts, and could we model that? And actually, in many respects, we had a lot of fun in trying a lot of that. But the bottom line conclusion, in a sense, was that in terms of those sciences, in a sense, for asking, if you ask them particular questions, you may have a very limited way to find something out that you can include in the model. But the more interesting things about lived experience will not be, let's say, you can't translate into any formula. So you have to find a way. I had to learn the hard way as well, say, becoming a qualitative social scientist, besides, let's say, a mathematical modeler, to find other ways to relate to a larger spectrum of science. It's a different type of science, with then always the question, okay, how do we organize the interaction? Where can we show there the limits of our assumptions, right? Yeah, I think it's a really interesting interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary methodological question of how DMDU methods, which are very heavily, I'm a big fan of the book, right? And I'm also reading and rereading it, and still wondering in terms of, okay, there's so much we try to model, and we have to keep trying. But what are the different ways we can engage with? I organized one session. Stephen was there as well. A meeting between DMDU and anthropologists. The anthropologists were actually interested in how the DMDU people were doing their work, but the DMDU people were interested in, can we learn something from you in improving our work, right? And those types of interactions, we had a first short start. Unfortunately, one of our counterparts, Steve Rayner, died in the meantime, but we'll find other ways with other people to continue those conversations. So that triggers a lot of interesting questions, Alejandra. It's by no means sorted, and it won't be for the next decades, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I was in a PhD program for math, and now I'm in a PhD program for policy analysis. So there's a huge disconnect right now, and it's hard for me to navigate.
Gidon, you had your hand up?
Yeah, just a short response to Alexandra's question. I think a lot of us scientists have learned the hard way that we don't have all the knowledge. We've made mistakes, we've come up with predictions and ideas and thoughts, and learned very quickly that we aren't necessarily always right. And the people, fishermen, the farmers, they often know at least as much as we do, and probably more than we do, because they are involved in working those systems day to day, and they have a real life experience with these ecosystems. And so I think a lot of us have become more humble in the way we think of ourselves as experts and the advice we give. And we, for example, when we construct our models to look at management issues of fisheries, we very often talk to both fishermen and to what's the word? I can't think of the word right now, but we often talk to the people that are in the environment, boots on the ground, getting their hands wet, to get their advice and their input and their experience in order to construct our models. And it's been a very, I think, humbling experience over the years for us scientists.
Let's see, we have 5 minutes left. Let me also take a whack at Alejandra's question, and I will try en passant to address a question that Obi has placed in the chat, basically on conditions in which quantitative models can be usefully used to explore plausible future scenarios as opposed to using methods from the arts and the humanities. So DMDU strives to have a big tent. Alejandra's question, I think, is fundamental. I ascribe to a view that that there is a systemic crisis in the institutions of democratic governance throughout the participatory democracies, whether they're found in Europe or the United States or South America or in Japan, Korea, wherever, Israel. And that one of the reasons that this is so is that these institutions are being asked to operate in an environment that the designers of these institutions never could have imagined. And that there are really two diffusion processes going on. One is that because of the internet and other means of communication and knowledge dissemination, there are a lot more centers of what I would call authoritative expertise outside of the government, and that these centers can coalesce into interest groups, stakeholder communities, and so on. So one diffusion is that there are many more seats at the table. There need to be more seats at the table than there were previously. The other diffusion process, if the one is a diffusion of authority, is a diffusion of responsibility. Whereas we are now dealing with categories of problems that are not clearly, completely answerable by the Ministry for Education, or the Ministry for Transportation, or the Ministry for Finance, or the Ministry for the Environment. They cut across all of those, and so now it becomes a problem of trying to figure out who is responsible. And the answer is, there is a shared responsibility, which very often does not work out too well in human institutions. So, part of the work that I and colleagues, both in my institution and other institutions are trying to do is precisely to understand how it is possible to bring multiple voices, multiple perspective, and competing interests into a common process in which there can be a structured, deliberative discussion of important issues, and particularly to conduct the analytical support for that sort of deliberation in a way that does not require us, upfront to determine which interests are valid and which are not valid, which assumptions are valid and which are not valid, which perspectives are valid and which are not, because people are not stupid, and they understand that those decisions that you make up front are going to, determine what you say at the end. Along those lines, and responding to Obi's question, I'm sorry, I can't see the full name in the chat, so I intend no disrespect. This is a question that has in particular perplexed me for a long time, because many of our methods in the DMDU community are based upon modeling and quantitative modeling. And that raises the question about what do you do in those environments where there is no formal modeling? Questions of diplomacy, war and peace, and so on. These communities do not refer to models, or do they? I would say that a model is a theory of causation, and some of them are formalized in mathematical language, and some of them exist between the ears of highly trained and highly experienced, let us say, diplomats. Diplomats who may look at the same body of known facts and draw entirely different conclusions based upon their experience, based upon the causal relationships that they understand the world to work by. And so, if you contact me offline, Alejandra, I'll be happy to point you to some work in which, Obi, I guess, but Alejandra as well, to some work that explores how you can bring DMDU analyses to places where, the discussion is more discursive and more narrative. Our time is at an end, unless the panel wish to, Arthur, I see you have a response to a question in here. If you want to have the last word, it's yours. Otherwise, we can.
People can read it in the chat, I think. I mean, this is a detailed question on why it took the IPCC so long to allow a conclusion that could not be modeled to enter the final kind of report, and that was the sociological question. I attribute it largely to the qualities of the chair.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me make one announcement, which is the next in our series of webinars will take place actually at 9 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time this evening. And it's a change of pace. It's actually a pub style quiz. It's a fun session. So for those of you who have finished your long work day in Europe, you can relax by zooming into our pub quiz at 9 p.m. Greenwich time. Those of you in the United States who have your own offices and can close your doors, you can do it and pretend like you're actually working. And those of you in other time zones can make your own decisions. So let me, on the behalf of the attendees, very much thank our panel for their thoughtful remarks. They entered into this willingly with not much formal structure, but were enthusiastic to participate, and their contributions have been extremely valuable. And thank you very much for those of you who attended on Zoom. And the next annual meeting will be held in Mexico in November of 2022. Hope to see many of you there. Thank you all.